Hello friends, this is Shubham and today I'm going to talk about cholinergic drugs. Actually the cholinergic drugs are basically divided into cholinergic agonists and cholinergic antagonists. But before discussing about cholinergic agonist, I would like to review the classification of our nervous system. So let's talk about nervous system. Our nervous system is divided into central nervous system, that is CNS, and peripheral nervous system, that is PNS. Further, peripheral nervous system is divided into autonomic nervous system, ANS, and somatic nervous system, which is SNS. Further, our autonomic nervous system is divided into two basic kinds: sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. So, most of the adrenergic drugs, they are related to the sympathetic nervous system. Most of the adrenergic drugs, they are related to the sympathetic nervous system. And most of the cholinergic drugs, they work on the parasympathetic nervous system. And our topic is today about the cholinergic agonists. So we will talk about the parasympathetic nervous system. Now before discussing really about the parasympathetic nervous system activities and the cholinergic drugs, I would like to tell you about the cholinergic neurotransmission. So let's talk about cholinergic neurotransmission. Cholinergic neurotransmission. Now, for example, this is our presynaptic membrane and this is our postsynaptic membrane, and between these two membranes there is synaptic gap, as we all know. So in the presynaptic membrane over here, choline will come into the presynaptic membrane with the help of sodium ions. So as choline will come inside the presynaptic membrane with the help of acetyl coenzyme A, it will make acetylcholine, and during this process the enzyme choline acetyltransferase will play a role. Choline acetyltransferase. With the help of this enzyme, choline and acetylcholine A, these will form the compound named acetylcholine. Now this acetylcholine will start accumulating inside the presynaptic cleft. For example, this is acetylcholine inside the presynaptic cleft. Now as the action potential generates, the calcium ions will go inside into the presynaptic membrane. Now as the calcium ions will start increasing in the presynaptic membrane, the acetylcholine will start releasing from the presynaptic cleft into the synaptic gap, and acetylcholine will start accumulating in the synaptic gap. Now there are receptors which are present over the presynaptic and postsynaptic membrane. These are muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptors. We will talk about them later on, but for a while let's talk that there is two kinds of receptors, muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptors. Actually, over these receptors, the acetylcholine will bind and further show the response. Meanwhile, in the synaptic gap, there is an enzyme which we named as acetylcholine esterase. Now what this enzyme will do, this enzyme will cleave down or will catabolize the acetylcholine into the acetyl coenzyme A and choline. So this enzyme, what it will do, that it will cleave down acetylcholine into acetyl coenzyme A and choline. Further, the choline will be uptake by the presynaptic membrane. Now, as we talk about the acetylcholine esterase enzyme, one more thing, the acetylcholine can bind to the postsynaptic membrane receptors and can also bind to the presynaptic membrane receptors to show the feedback response. For example, if acetylcholine is accumulating more and more in synaptic gap, so acetylcholine can bind to the presynaptic receptors and can generate the negative feedback loop. So after understanding this cholinergic neurotransmission, basic concept of cholinergic neurotransmission, let's further move on to the cholinergic receptors, that how many kinds of cholinergic receptors are there and where are those. So let's talk about the cholinergic receptors. Cholinergic receptors. Actually, basically there are two kinds of cholinergic receptors. That is muscarinic and another one is nicotinic. There are two kinds of cholinergic receptors, muscarinic cholinergic receptors and nicotinic cholinergic receptors, also named as M or N cholinergic receptors. Now further, these muscarinic cholinergic receptors are divided into 5 kinds of receptors. Those are named as M1, M2, M3, M4 and M5. More usually we focus on these three, M1, M2 and M3 receptors, and we will not talk about more about the M4 and M5 cholinergic receptors. Now among these muscarinic cholinergic receptors, these 5 cholinergic receptors, some receptors are stimulatory and some receptors are inhibitory. So the question is how to remember the muscarinic receptors, that which one is stimulatory and which one is inhibitory. So the simple formula or simple mnemonic for remembering these receptors, that which one is stimulatory and which one is inhibitory, you can remember it by this simple mnemonic, that if you will create the M, so focus over the first peak of the M cholinergic receptor, first peak of this M letter, and named it as 1. This second one 2, and this third one is, for example, 3. So let's suppose This one is M1 cholinergic receptor, this one is M2, and this one is our M3. So these peak are these like stimulatory, like these one will give us stimulation, and these lower peak will tell us about like this is for inhibitory response or inhibition. So M1 is stimulatory, M2 is inhibitory, M3 is again stimulatory, and if you will talk about more like M4 and M5, if you will extend this M like this, hypothetically for an example, for remembering the theory about stimulation and inhibition, so named it as fourth one and this one is as fifth one. So fifth one is stimulatory and this one is inhibitory. So you can remember it like this method. However, there are other methods also. For example, if you will make a fist like this one which is pointing upward, this one you can remember as M1, and the downwards you can remember as M2. Again, upward that will peak one is M3, and the decline one is M4, and again it's M5. So those three peaks in upward direction, these are 1, 3 and 5, and those downwards, those are 2 and 4. So you can remember it like this also, like in odd numbers like 1, 3 and 5, those are stimulatory, and in even numbers like 2 and 4, these are inhibitory. So these are very simple tricks to remember that which M receptor is stimulatory and which M receptor is inhibitory. So after talking about the stimulatory and inhibitory receptors, let's talk about the location of these receptors, that where are these receptors located in our body. So let's talk about this. If you talk about the common location for these receptors, just forget everything and remember just only brain, our CNS. Our brain contains all the muscarinic cholinergic receptors. If you talk about M1, M2, M3, M4, M5, all the receptors are present in our CNS. So that is the basic location that you can remember as CNS for all. Now, if you talk about specifically about M1 receptor, where are these receptors located? M1 receptor is located in CNS. Those are located in ganglia. M1 receptor are also located in some gastric glands. If you will talk about the M2 receptor, and all these three locations where these receptors are located, M1 receptor, as I told you about that these receptors are stimulatory. So as the drug will come, those drugs are gonna stimulate these receptors and gonna perform their actions. So if you talk about the M2, this is our heart. So M2 cholinergic receptors are present in our heart. For example, this is our heart. Now if you will talk about M3 cholinergic receptor, these are present at like various locations. Like these are present in endocrine glands. These are present in smooth muscles of various organs like eyes, GIT, bronchi of our lungs, salivatory glands, our lacrimatory glands, and these M3 receptors are also located in endothelium of our capillaries. So these M3 receptors are also located in endothelium of our capillaries, where they secrete more and more nitric oxide upon stimulation of the receptor, and will cause further hypotension and vasodilation. So we will talk about that later when we talk about the cholinergic agonist drugs. So, and if we talk about the M4 and M5 muscarinic receptors, as I told you about them, just remember one location, that is CNS. CNS is actually the common location for all these kinds of receptors. And these were the places where these muscarinic receptors are located. Now, if we talk about the nicotinic cholinergic receptors, nicotinic cholinergic receptors are basically two kinds of receptors. These are neuromuscular, like the receptors which are located at the neuromuscular junction, and the neuroneuronal sites, receptor which are present in the neuroneuronal junction. Now, what kind of receptors have these, like muscarinic receptors, what kind of receptors have these ones, and nicotinic receptors have which kind of receptors? So, in muscarinic, we have G protein coupled receptors. Now, in muscarinic we have G protein coupled receptors, and in nicotinic we have ligand gated ion channels. Now, these ligand gated ion channels are rapidly acting as compared to the G protein coupled receptors. As I told you in my previous video, that G coupled protein receptor is serpentine receptor which penetrate the cell membrane 7 times. That's why we call it as serpentine receptor. And these receptors are working slowly as compared to the ligand gated ion channels. Now, how these channels work? Actually, the M1 and M3 receptors, as they are stimulatory, they work on the GQ receptor, G protein coupled receptor, GQ receptor, and our M2 receptor. These work upon the GI, which is another kind of G protein coupled receptor. They work according to the GI. I because of inhibitory, because as I told you, M2 is our inhibitory receptor. So actually, whenever there is a drug which is binding to M1 cholinergic receptor, so it will stimulate GQ, G protein coupled receptor, and what it will do over there, that it will increase the intracellular calcium ions, which will lead to furthermore contractions, for example in our muscles. Now, if we talk about M1 and M3, the same mechanism would be there, like it will increase the calcium ions intracellularly and will increase the contraction and will help in the contraction of the muscles. And if we talk about the M2 cholinergic receptor, it will work by, the drug will bind to the G inhibitory G coupled protein receptors, and what it will do, actually these will increase the potassium ions intracellularly. Now, what will the potassium ions do? They will cause the hyperpolarization of the cell. Now, if the cell will be hyperpolarized, there will be no more action potential. Now, as you all know, if the action potential will not be there, then the muscle will not be able to contract anymore. So, as potassium ions will increase intracellularly, hyperpolarization will occur. Which will lead to no more contraction. So, these were the discussions about the cholinergic receptors, and in my next video I will talk about the cholinergic drugs in more detail. So till then, thanks for watching this video. Thank you.